guys, it's Sam, and these are my favorite books of 2022. I narrowed this down to 10 in theory, but then I added 2 on because they were by the same authors as another book that I said was a favorite. So technically there's 12 books here, but I swear I would still consider this in top 10. It's just, I just couldn't decide. It's 12. It's 12. It's technically 12. These are in no particular order besides the order roughly that I read them in. I don't know if I could actually choose like a favorite out of the year. And in addition to this video, I will also be doing my 2022 book awards and superlatives because there's other books that aren't like, these are all 5 stars, for example. But there's other books that aren't 5 stars that I still would consider like really great books for the year. And I feel like those like superlatives book awards videos are good for telling you more about like a different variety of books. But these are the books that I think are the best things that I read this year. So first is The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid. This is one of the first books that I read this year, the first book that I fully started and finished in 2022, and I loved this. This is a standalone adult novel that is inspired by Eastern European folklore and mythology, something that you guys know that I love. This follows a pagan girl in a village who doesn't have any magic, and when the woodsmen come to take one of the girls who is supposed to be like sort of like a seer, she is sort of sacrificed because that person is like very important to the village and she's kind of like a nobody to them, so they kind of sacrifice her and say like take her to this like main city that is basically this like patriarchal faith, which is sort of supposed to be like a one-to-one for Christianity or like Catholicism. And so there's a lot of political machinations there. There's a forest with like lots of creatures that is very much sentient. There are like, you know, pagan gods and like New World gods, like all of the gods are real in this world. And there's also sort of like, again, like a one-to-one Jewish tradition as well that she discovers her connection to. And so there's just a lot of great things. In addition to that, there's also this tension and dynamic with one of the woodsmen and this like enemies to lovers dynamic as well, because they are very much on opposite sides of this like religious conquering thing that's happening. So yeah, there's that, and there's really good lines there about like how he worships her and everything, and it's just really fantastic. So many themes here that I love, and Ava Reid quickly became one of my favorite authors because my other book on the list by them is Juniper and Thorne, which I read way later on in the year, but I'm going to talk about now because same author. This is another standalone. This is more of a horror fantasy, very much based in horror. Again, has that Eastern European folklore mythology and follows a character who is one of the daughters of the last remaining wizard in this city. This is more of a modern story. I would say it's probably like comparatively like, I don't know, late 1800s, early 1900s based on like what the time frame is. Again, this is taking place in a magical world, so time isn't exactly one-to-one to ours, but that's kind of where this is, where that was much more of a like older fantasy. And her father is incredibly abusive and awful, and her 2 sisters want to sneak out one night and go to this ballet, which her father deems as like incredibly sinful, and she ends up kind of having this spark with one of the lead performers, and that sort of has everything take off from there. It's not even quite about that though. This is a story about like what makes monsters who are monsters, trauma of families. Everyone in here is essentially pretty bad. Like, yes, her dad is the worst, but also her sisters are pretty awful people. There are a ton of triggers in here. I would list them all here, but I don't want to forget all of them, and I forgot to write them down when talking about this. But there's a ton of triggers for like basically everything. So check out my story graph in particular for any triggers about any of these books, because I list all of them in my reviews. But this has triggers for like everything. I mean, everything from sexual abuse and violence and abusive families to cannibalism to like torture and xenophobia, like everything. So this is a very heavy book, and one of the reasons that I loved this actually so much is that this is horror without being scary, but is an incredibly unsettling story where you're just left feeling uncomfortable the entire time. And I think that was just very masterfully done. The visuals here are so compelling that I still think about a lot of things in this book. And again, the love story is not even a central piece of this for me the way that it was for Wolf and the Woodsman, but the way that Ava Reid juxtaposes that against like truly horrible, horrific things just leaves you unsettled the entire time. And if you have the capacity to read this with all the triggers, highly recommend it, but it's definitely not for everyone. If you don't think that you could handle this book, The Wolf and the Woodsman, while still being heavy, has the same beautiful writing without all of the triggering content. So yeah, this year Ava Reid became a new favorite auto read, probably auto buy author for me. Next we have The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. Really the entire Devabad trilogy is represented with this book. This is a series that I read this year. I reread City of Brass even though I read that in previous year and read the whole series this year. This is an adult fantasy series that follows the main character of Nafri, who is growing up in Cairo. She is a young woman, adult woman, within 18th century Cairo, and she gets abducted by a jinn after she accidentally does a ritual and gets taken off to Devabad, which is the city of the jinn. And there, throughout the series, she realizes her place there, her like history and her magic. There's a ton of political machinations. There is some like love story stuff, but it's very secondary. It's just a lot about like gods and religion and politics and conquerors and revenge and vengeance and healing that and like all of that cultural stuff. It's so good, so masterfully done. I do think City of Brass was probably like my favorite. City of Brass and Empire of Gold are like probably 1-to-1. Like I love them both. I didn't quite like the second book as much. There is a time jump in that book, just as an FYI. I don't really think that's a spoiler. There's just a time jump. So that is like a little hard for me sometimes, but still the whole thing overall, masterpiece. I would definitely reread it. So good. Then we have Iron Widow by Siren J. Zhao. This is the first book in a YA sci-fi with some fantastical elements duology. And this is inspired by some Chinese like culture and mythology and history. It takes place in a world where boys are recruited to run these giant mechs to fight off an alien invader, but they use they like pair men and women together and they use women's life force, basically drain them to run these mechs. And our main character had a loved one who died that way, and she does eventually end up getting recruited, but she knows a way to take over that power herself and is like, again, like a widow, like a black widow, going on sort of like a vengeance quest for that. There's also a polyamorous love triangle, not even love triangle, it's just polyamorous dynamic that she's involved in that also helps power the mechs. It's amazing. I'm so excited for the next book that's coming out this year. This was the perfect female rage, vengeance, good for her type story. And although there were some plot things that were like, this kept it from being quite a 5 stars. And this is the only one that's not a 5 stars possibly on this entire list. But there were some like sort of like pacing things, storytelling things that weren't completely perfect for me, but overall so good. This is one of the books that has definitely stuck with me the entire year that I still think about, and fantastic. Then we have Book Lovers by Emily Henry. A lot of people know about this because it won the Goodreads Choice Award for Best Romance this year. I think that was well deserved. It is really good. This is a adult contemporary romance that follows a main character who is kind of stereotypically the girl that would get left in the Hallmark movie. She's a city girl, she's a book agent, she is like really into her city life, but then ends up having to go to a small town, and she ends up actually seeing her like nemesis, who's an editor who turned down a book that is very popular that ended up like being really successful, but this is sort of her like nemesis, and they end up sort of having this like rivals to lovers situation happening. But this is about the love of books, this is about sort of that like small town, this is about not changing who you are for someone, about still being able to be loved when you've considered yourself kind of unlovable in a lot of ways, or very like rough around the edges. This resonated with me so much and I loved it so much. And we have The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek. This is the story of Angerboda, who is Loki's wife within Norse mythology, but this is sort of similar to a lot of books that have come out recently that are retellings of myths that build up the story of a particular character we don't know much about. So think Circe by Madeline Miller, things like that. That is that for Norse mythology. So we have this character who ties in a lot of other Norse mythological figures and is like, what if that was her? And she is one of those old witch in the woods, original witch archetypes, and we follow her life as this figure within Norse mythology that's like kind of immortal and one of the original witches. I love an original witch. It's why I love Circe. It's why I love her. A witch in the woods, original witch. It's just my jam completely. This also really speaks to motherhood and family and just like, again, like trauma and everything. Yes, she's in a relationship with Loki, but I wouldn't say that that's even a strong point. A lot of times I'm like, girl, why are you even like near him? But her as a character I love and adore. And again, if you like these kinds of stories that flesh out a character from myth that we don't know a lot about, particularly a woman, you're probably gonna enjoy this. Then we have Elder Race by Adrian Shipkowski. This is one of the books that I read for the Hugo Awards because it was nominated for the novella. So this is a novella that's sort of a sci-fi fantasy blend because it's following two characters. One is a anthropologist scientist that was trapped on this planet because he was sent to observe humanity because years ago apparently we sort of recolonized certain areas and then let humanity do its thing without them knowing where they came from. So he's from sort of a far future science-based reality, but then one of the other characters that he runs into from that planet considers everything to be fantastical. So she thinks of him as a wizard, etc. And the way that this is written and the way that these two perspectives view things, and even the way that sometimes like he will talk to her and sort of be translated in a fantastical way is so good. There's some like multi-dimensional things going on here. It's this perfect blend of science and fantasy depending on perspective that is so well done, and that made me actually want to read more of this author. So this was a 5 out of 5 star, one of my favorite novellas that I read for that little challenge I was doing for myself around the Hugos. And if you like this, what is science, what is fantasy, that fantasy could be just science we don't understand kind of thing, and that commentary, you'll probably like this. Then we have A Master of Gin by P. Djeli Clark. This is another book that I read for the Hugos and absolutely loved. This is taking place in a early 1900s, you know, around 1912 Cairo, where there is, it's sort of like a, again, like sort of like a steampunky type setting, but this has that with gods and different creatures. Basically, the world was sort of like, there was like a Terran sort of reality, and a bunch of like jinn and other creatures came into our world and made certain areas like very magical. So we have a main character who was working for sort of this like magical society, sort of like police force, and having to investigate a murder of this sort of like cult-like, well, a cult. It's like the murder of a bunch of like cultists, and everything sort of unravels from there. There's jinn, there's angels, but like they're angels that are sort of like mechs. There's all this stuff, and this is such like a fast-paced world. There's again different gods and different religions. There's a sapphic relationship in here, and this is a world that is so interesting. There's a couple other short stories also in this world that I read and really enjoyed, and this has to be more than just one book. Like, this has to be a series. There is no like second book announced as of when I've been filming this, or as of what I know. I haven't heard anyone talk about it, but this needs to be a series because this is a fantastic world that is so interesting and just like so fast-paced and fun, and loved this. Then we have another 2-for-1 because I really couldn't pick one. I think of the two, maybe The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers has stuck with me more, but I also loved A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. These are the two books that I had not read in the Wayfarer series. It's an adult sci-fi series that is slice of life, and each book is a companion novel, so you don't have to read them really in any kind of order, which is why I read these out of order. This is 2, this is 4. So I read them 1, 3, 2, 4. These all follow just kind of, again, like a slice of life thing happening. A Closed and Common Orbit is a AI that was recently sort of like reset, and now she is in sort of like an android body and has having to discover like who she is, identity, what makes a human, and that's juxtaposed with her caretaker, who also has a history with AI, who is sort of like a clone. They're sort of discovering like, again, the overlaps between their lives. Then The Galaxy and the Ground Within is an entirely alien cast. In most of the books there's like aliens and stuff, but usually it's following humans. This is an entirely alien cast. They get stuck at a waypoint where they all can't leave, and it's this like cross-cultural thing going on where they have to help each other, and there's lots of like, again, cultural biases and different things between the alien races, and it's very sweet. So I loved both of these. Every single book in the Wayfarer series is 5 out of 5 stars. So again, I couldn't necessarily pick a favorite. Again, The Galaxy and the Ground Within I think is the one that stuck with me slightly more, but I love both of them. I love all of the themes of every single Wayfarer's book. I know Becky Chambers is not for everyone, but she is for me, and I love her. Then we have The Once and Future Witches by Alex C. Harrow. This is a standalone adult fantasy that follows 3 sisters in New Salem, right around the suffragette movement, but they are the leaders of this witchcraft movement. They each represent a witchcraft archetype of the mother, maiden, and crone, and the use of fairy tales and language passed down to women and magic passed down to women, and just like the archetype of fighting off sort of like patriarchal society, but also how women are like villainized and things, and their magic is taken from them and rising up and things. It's so excellent. It's so good. I listened to the audiobook. I highly recommend it. The audiobook is fantastic. As somebody who's into witchy things, this was one of the perfect witch books that I've ever read. I was hesitant about it because Alex E. Harrow hasn't always worked for me, and a lot of her books lean much more like historical, like the 10,000 Doors January or whatever. It was much more historical leaning. I thought this would be as well. This is way less about the suffragette movement as it is about witchcraft and like folktale and things. Excellent if you like those themes. There's also some really good relationships in here. They are not the main point, but one is sapphic and one is a man that is totally obsessed with this woman who is pregnant, has like another man's child. He like goes so hard for her, which I love. So it's a minor point, but it was a wonderful addition and I loved this book. And finally, my last favorite of the year, and the reason that I don't do wrap-up videos in December because I inevitably read a favorite book of the year in December, that's Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. This is the first book in the Burning Kingdom series and follows two characters primarily, although there's other POVs in the story. One is Priya, who is a sort of like handmaiden in the regent's household. She lives in a nation that has been sort of like colonized by an empire, like an evil empire, because that's what empires be doing. And she eventually has to go back to this temple that she has a connection to because that's where our other main character, Malini, is being held, who is the emperor's sister that he wants to burn because he apparently just like hates women. And part of their religion is like burning women, and she refuses to be burned, and so she's being held at this other like city sort of nation state until she decides that she's going to let herself be burned. And so these two people come in contact. There is a lot of forest magic, elemental magic. There's a forest that's taking people over, which is a big thing for me and is like corrupting them. And there's different gods, there's different prophecies. All of the gods have equal weight. A bunch of things that I really love, and again, all those other POVs I enjoyed as well as far as like adding to the story. And this is a great first book setting up a lot of things, and I'm excited to see how the rest of the series go. I love Tasha Suri. I'm surprised it took me this long to read this because I love her Books of Amba series. This, I'm excited to see how this series develops. So those are my favorite books of 2022. Comment down below, let me know some of your favorites or what you thought of these books. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.